Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Brian Wieser, principal of Madison and Wall. Well, what a pleasure. Another year and a lot of change. Brian, you are always welcome on the show, and we're just absolutely excited to talk about these crazy times. So how
I
are you?
know. I'm good. It's been busier and crazier in a good way than ever. Hopefully the same for you as well this year.
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, welcome. It's like old friends. So since we're old friends, let's start at the top. A lot going on, and I know our audience. The merger is on everybody's mind, and I know you have a unique perspective. That intersection between Madison Avenue and Wall Street, so you can see things with a lot of balance. So let's start with your take on pros and cons, and I guess the big question also is, was this a surprise?
Yeah, I think that let's answer the last question first. I think that that there would be some kind of significant M&A activity for the industry at this point is not a surprise. There had been enough rumblings and there are enough catalysts for this sort of thing. I mean, frankly, it was inevitable 10 years ago too. Anyone remembers what I was saying then. So it's not a surprise in that sense. The specific combination is a little bit of a surprise, but not like the Publicis Omnicom shock. That was just unfathomable. And so in that sense, no. Uh, yeah, I mean, now I guess what your other question was, what got us here?
Well, yeah, and well, please answer that. And yes, what got us here, but also what do you see? Because you always have such balanced views of the pros and cons of all this.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, I mean, again, the pros and cons here. The first of all is scale really has a lot of advantages. 10 years ago, we would have been talking mostly about the advantages of scale in context of media, whether it came down to the tools and the processes, the negotiating clout, the pricing advantages that followed from more information. That's all still valid here, but I think that scale matters on a lot of other things. Investments in people who are capable of working with AI based products and software, investments in people who are able to work with retail media. It's been a real problem for so much of the industry, I think, and Flywheel kind of highlighted it that agencies have had a really hard time attracting, retaining people with real expertise in retail media. And so the fact that you have a lot of scale makes it easier to attract more people. And you could say flywheel. That's very circular here. So I think that that's another example where the scale really matters. Scale and partnerships, making sure you're the first port of call when some new technology is available. Um, there's just a lot of things that, where scale really, really is helpful. But that also leads to where some of the downsides could be from this transaction or anything like it, where the bigger the organization, the greater the risks of dysfunction and dyssynergies too. Because in a people-based business that's dependent on people, the more complicated the organization is, if the organization is not managed in a streamlined manner, you could have a lot of extra dysfunction. And I think how they manage people or not is going to be one of the biggest challenges. Now, scale matters in the sense that a larger brand is better than a smaller one when you're trying to service large global marketers. But at the same time, the process of getting to a singular brand disempowers a lot of people. And that creates a lot of risk, either people getting poached, clients deciding they're not going to wait to see how things settle out. Um, and then just a lack of certainty around who's going to be someone else's boss in a year's time. So those are real negative considerations from a transaction like this one.
Well, the things that I've been reading, since there's an outpouring of opinion, and information, is that people are questioning now, is bigger really better? I think you've put forth a good argument that scale has its advantages, but scale has its advantages, perhaps in technology and less in a people business. Not just curious as to your initial take on that.
I don't fully agree with that. Now, let's be clear also that I think there are many ways to compete in this industry, and that there will be many ways smaller businesses can be very competitive. But I think that when it comes to things like, again, the example that I saw firsthand, and I know is going to happen with AI, is that it's really hard to attract people unless you create a career path for people who can be among the best in the field that they're working in. So in retail media, you can be a business with 50,000 employees, and if you've got five specialists in an area, that's not a great situation because attracting the sixth one is going to be really hard. If you have 500, now you can attract number 501, 502, 503, 504, 505, 506, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you're the person with that specialty, you've got a place you can call for a career potentially, or at least it'll feel like it, even if the world changes in 5 years. And I think it's one of the obstacles that a lot of agencies had over the last really decade as retail media was becoming a thing, that the best people would just go off to the sellers because there wasn't much, sure, you could be a big fish in a small pond, and there were certain individual situations that would work out great. But generally speaking, it was really challenging. So scale matters even in that people business.
No, it's interesting that you say that. I'm curious just to look at the other aspect of that. I mean, look, businesses change all the time. It seems to me that the agency business has been at an inflection point, if you want to call that, for a while now. I mean, I've read things, quotes that, gee, ad agencies don't even do advertising anymore. It's always fun to have those little memes or whatever it is. But I'm wondering if this merger goes through, and John Wren is certainly insistent that it will. Does this change the agency business or the media agency business really forever?
I don't see it changing the business by itself. I think it makes for a more efficient individual business. It might be a catalyst for a lot of other transactions, which collectively could have an impact, but by itself, no. I mean, again, this is a one plus one equals two and a quarter. You know,
No, I'm loving your math. I think other people might not come up with the same number, but it's very interesting. But what about the agency business? I mean, you've been in it for so long. Well, I mean, you're in a different aspect of it now in many
yeah,
ways, but you start, well, you part of your career was
yeah,
working for a number of agencies. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, has it evolved due to client need, or has it evolved due to technology, media change, or is it not something we should worry about? We just get on with it.
Well, yeah, there's always an evolution. I mean, the thing is, one thing that was clear to me when I first started working in the agency world was that whatever you did last year, you should plan on, being 10% less expensive to the client next year. The client's budget does go up, but you have to have a new offering to satisfy that budget and sustain your share of wallet. Agencies that have done well have continually evolved what they're offering. The services, if it's the same service they did last year, that's not worth the same next year. So when you think about the new services that have come into existence, top of mind, IT services, various data services, um, even bundling media with services in ways that weren't case 10 and 20 years ago. Um, those are all things. I think that again, IT services is where I think some of the greatest growth opportunities are. It's fundamentally very different in many ways, requires different people, but it's also similar in that it's all professional services. It's all satisfying marketing goals, and making sure that the people leading the account and leading the services understand marketing remains as critical as ever.
No, no, you make an interesting point. Okay, so if this is part of the evolution of the agency world, how will it affect 2025? Or how will it affect one's expectations for
Yeah.
2025?
Well, this transaction may not close until the end of 25.
Oh,
So,
is it? I thought it would be halfway through the
sec
year. So
well,
yeah,
yeah, it's true. It could be sometime in the second half.
yeah.
Would be their expectation. But no, I don't think it really impacts the industry by itself. Again, unless it catalyzes other M&A. So does Accenture go out and buy something? Does one of the other holdcos break itself up into little bits? There's so many different choices that could be made. Um, I think that by itself, again, this deal doesn't change the industry all of a sudden. It is part of a continuum of how the industry is evolving. But I do think it, we've been waiting for a deal like this since at least the Publicis Omnicom attempted merger. And as you may remember, I wrote at the time, I mean, uh, M&A begets more M&A. Um, Companies feel they need to adapt in response to the changes, and it's circular. So, assuming this deal goes through, it could then catalyze additional transactions, and then collectively, those could have some impact.
You,
Individually, it doesn't.
yeah, you mentioned Accenture. Would you see other players, WPP, for example, or Publicis who had a good year, or see other changes there, or is it just too early to say?
Yeah, it is definitely too early to say. I would opine that Publicis is the one traditional agency group that has a very coherent strategy. They've been investing against it for a very long time. You'd be surprised to see them change path, although just don't rule anything out. Accenture, from a different vantage point, has been very consistent as well with the strategy they've been pursuing. So, it's hard to say that they would suddenly change. WPP, not so much of a clear strategy, so hard to say. Of us, well, they're just now becoming independent on their own. Dentsu's kind of in a funny place, to say the least. So I think that at least the latter group of three are each going to have to figure out and refine what exactly their strategies are. Do they want to? It's hard to be stuck in the middle, if you will. There are clear advantages to being a lot larger. There might be advantages to being smaller and more specialized. Um, it's not clear that being kind of middle sized is going to be a great place to be.
Interesting, very, very interesting. Let's just continue with 2025 for a minute, because I think that when you talk about 2025, you bring up the word uncertainty. Am I correct? Um,
Yeah, because we just don't know, especially in the United States, how policies will actually come into existence. We know the new administration has made a lot of claims about what they'd like to do, but we just don't know what they'll actually do.
yeah, what issues do you think in 2025 would impact the advertising market, both positively and negatively? I mean, from
Yeah. The,
regulation to whatever. Yeah.
well, the biggest issues that I would point to do relate to certainly tariffs and potential deportations of large numbers of individuals. Both of them could cause significant supply chain disruptions. And those supply chain disruptions would then impact advertising because if you don't have goods in stores or available as services, then you're not going to market them as much. And with tariffs in particular, higher prices um, could be problematic. Not necessarily, that can be positive for advertising, but it's negative in the sense that so much of the spending growth that we've seen in the United States has come from cross-border advertisers. And it's not clear just how much the industry would get hurt by this. But if you made it impossible for cross-border physical goods-based marketers, Timu as a kind of an example, Shein, that could have a pretty negative, meaningful negative consequence. You can look to other areas like, there's speculation um, at present that Mondelez is looking at buying Hershey. Perfect example. If something like that occurs, and in many industries, things like that will occur, more M&A, that has the effect of actually reducing total advertising. And so, I mean, in general, I think when there's M&A consolidation side of a category, as spenders of advertising, you'll get less advertising. There are positive factors in the sense that, okay, inflation should be positive, assuming the economy doesn't go off the rails. You know, interest rates probably come down. That's probably positive, and you might have a looser regulatory environment, which, putting societal consequences aside, can lead to more advertising. So there's pros and cons, but on balance, um, and then of course there's restrictions on certain categories like pharma, which I think is very likely. It's hard to say how certain. Collectively, those factors are all somewhat negative, but we're still expecting what would be a decent growth year, unless again the economy completely falls apart.
Let me just ask you. You brought up two things. Let me address each one of them. Last year you talked a lot about cross-border and how China and Vietnam were some of the biggest contributors to the U.S. advertising economy. Do you see that continuing, or will there be other players who might come in and then the follow on? What about the rest of the world?
Yeah. Well, you touched on some of the one of the key issues. Like, do all those Chinese cross-border advertisers get hit by tariffs? You tell me. Last time I was invited to White House policy meetings for an incoming administration was never. So we don't know what they're going to do specifically. The other thing is that some of this could be offset by using a third market or a third country like Vietnam to be the country that actually fulfills things. So it's hard to know with any precision.
Well, look, we're looking for answers, but sometimes uncertainty is an answer unto itself.
That is the case here for sure.
You mentioned something else. You mentioned that there could be decent growth. I mean, what do you figure the estimate is for total media expenditure in 2025? Are we going to break
Yeah,
some new ceilings or?
yeah. Well, we brought our numbers down for 2025 from where we were before off of a very, very robust 2024. So we're now calling for 4.5% growth rather than 5.3 for 2025 ex political. So we are bringing it down because now that we know what the administration is, and we can assess pros and cons on balance, you should be more negatively skewed around next year. Again, politics aside, just purely looking at headwinds and tailwinds of factors that impact advertising. Um, but again, that's off of a very difficult comparable for this year. Now, to say that there is still what would look like a normal growth if this were the 2000s or many of the 2010s, I mean, it's just because the underlying economy does feel like it's relatively strong. One can hope it's resilient enough to, you know, kind of just keep progressing through what will be a very disruptive period. Um, there are risks that are to the downside well of this, of course. I think we can all anticipate or we can all imagine what those possible sources of downside could be. I guess, and to take the counter side to that, why I don't think one should be particularly positive relative to where you would have been prior to November. Okay, sure, maybe there'll be tax cuts, but that doesn't have anything to do with advertising. Doesn't have any real impact. And then you get all these risks of chaos in all sorts of different ways that would not have been quite as true
Oh, well,
otherwise.
speaking of chaos, I mean, what about the whole geopolitical situation worldwide? I mean, it feels like there's not a region where there isn't some level of explosive unrest.
Sure, and that doesn't usually have much impact on advertising.
Isn't that amazing? You
Well,
wouldn't think that
it's
some
not it's
marketers would want to hold back a little bit, or yeah.
it doesn't relate to how economies behave. Now, to be clear, the Ukrainian ad market is not what it was in
Yes, of
2021.
course. Nor the
Um,
Syrian, nor the Syrian, yes.
yeah, exactly. Israel's been disrupted too in all
Yeah.
sorts of ways. But when we look at the global ad market, these aren't large numbers. And so you don't have that kind of disruption. I mean, actually, an interesting case will be what happens in Romania this coming year, because now there you have a more or less conventional advertising market. It's going to go through some challenges with what's happening in their presidential election. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think again, it might provide an interesting case. I have studied this matter, for a project I did prior to January 6th, 2021, and then immediately after. I wanted to know, coming out of the 2020 election, what happens in societies that go through unrest, meaningful unrest, maybe not full-scale civil war or full-scale wars, but real unrest. And so I interviewed individuals who were around Quebec in the 1970s, in Ireland in the 1980s. I tried to speak to people who had some knowledge of history of Spain in the early 30s, markets where you had advertising markets and where you had real polarization, obviously led to much more disastrous consequences in Spain, less so in Ireland, and much less so in Canada. The basic takeaway that came from those conversations, interestingly, in context of a new series on Hulu, I was told by one of my former Irish colleagues, he used the words of the poet who wrote this poem, "Whatever you say nothing." This was the attitude that brands tended to take. And they just kept doing what they were doing, and they just tried to avoid talking about any of this stuff. And I think that it's kind of interesting. A point I was making 4 years ago was that in a world of social media, it'll be harder for brands to not take positions, because if you don't take the position, consumers will make it for you. So I still think that's generally true. But in terms of the money being out there to go and spend by advertising on media, they just keep doing what they're doing as long as the economy doesn't completely get in the way.
No, I mean that's very interesting, and we could have a whole nother conversation about what a brand should and shouldn't say. I mean, obviously it's relative to the brand and its positioning and to its purpose and everything else. I'm wondering though, just in turn, are there hotspot? Oh, hotspots may be the wrong term, but are there places in the world where you think there will be more growth than what we're seeing for the
Well,
4.5% in the
yeah, and in my current capacity, we were not building data sets for countries outside the United States. But I mean, I think you would generally mirror economic activity to the advertising market. Now, I can say with certainty that the correlations between economic activity and advertising are surprisingly poor in many countries, but it's a good starting place. I don't have any hard numbers for countries outside of the US. I would certainly point people to Group M and the wonderful K. Scott Dawkins, or Interpublic's Magna Global, and Vince Latang. Always fabulous there.
No, no, you also mentioned something else. You've been talking about retail media or commerce media, whatever we're now calling it. And I guess it's not retail anymore, because not only retailers are jumping on the bandwagon, we're seeing the financial category, the travel category, and so on getting involved. So do you think this is still the big growth spot that you believe
Yeah.
was last year? Or
Well, to be clear, I'd say retail media is still retail media. It's just, I think that when we're talking about retail media, we often need to be a bit more precise. And that's why I like the term commerce media, as I think it's a bit broader. And we're really just talking about, closed loop entities who can fulfill as well as sell advertising. And so that's the common thread there. Now, I do think that that category is going to face additional pressures this year because they are so heavily exposed to cross-border advertising, with retail media in particular. It doesn't mean they can't keep growing, but we just don't have enough data to really know how exposed they are. So certainly our numbers came down for broadly defined retail media for 2025. Call it 10% growth feels pretty good if it grew closer to 20 in 2024. So that would be a pretty meaningful slowdown. I do fear it could be worse than that, but it could be better too.
all right, well, it could be worse, it could be better. Just looking back for a minute, were there any surprises in 2024 in the last year that you may not have anticipated? Maybe the political advertising number or
Well, well, the big surprise for this year was frankly just how strong the market was I mean, it's really extraordinary that most of this year, I mean, we're seeing like 10% growth each quarter, excluding political. Um, that's not normal. And so, our number right now for the full year is like a 9% number. It could very well be 10 for the full year if the fourth quarter comes in really strong. It's been remarkable because there were some really hard comparables in the year ago period, especially in the last year. And the resilience of the advertising market has been just surprising, to say the least. So
Um,
I don't know.
Interesting, interesting. All right, so we've got resilience perhaps as the word for 2024. As we look at 2025, what would be the one word that characterizes things? Is it uncertainty?
Uncertainty, absolutely. I mean, again, we had resilience in a strong underlying economy. In 2024, we have uncertainty in terms of policy. We have uncertainty in terms of what the economic outlook actually ends up looking like as well.
Interesting, interesting. And in this day and age, we can't have any kind of a discussion without a word about AI. Is what, what's your take on is AI, the ANA I think has chosen AI as the word of the year among marketers for the third time now, 2 years in a row, and AI was chosen several years ago as well. But as opposed to being a disruptive force, I assume it's a force that's going to make things better, in terms of some of the promises that marketers have been looking forward to for years, whether it's greater personalization or whatever it might be. Yeah.
I wouldn't ever assume that something new is necessarily better.
Interesting.
I mean, sometimes we make choices for things that seem better, but then they have costs and consequences that make it impossible to recapture what was better before.
Oh my God.
So,
That sounds like marriage counseling.
well, I mean, it's just, for example, if we train all of our people on how to prompt AI-based tools and we get really good at all the processes that work with them, we might find that after several years that it's actually all a lot less effective than the old methods, but nobody seems to remember how to do them.
Ah, well, we can only wait and see. And given that we've been able to do that throughout our careers, maybe you should put that down as a prediction. 7 years from today.
I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying I don't take it as a given that you always get continuous improvement.
No, I think that's smart. I actually do think that's smart, particularly for an industry that falls in love with the new.
Absolutely.
Well, anything else you'd like to say about these two big topics, the merger or our look at 2025?
No, I just think that, this is going to be a very interesting year to continue to watch the industry evolve. And good news is for those who are trying to focus on understanding change is it's never ending.
All right. Well, I think that might be key. I wish I could understand change better, but I guess we just got to live with it.
Absolutely.
It's always a joy speaking with you, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. You bring so much history and the kind of cross perspectives of the whole economic world and the advertising specialist world and so on. So it's always a joy. Thank
Great.
you. And listen, best wishes for a great 2025, regardless of what it brings.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks.
Thanks.
The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.